Sure. Hey there, everyone. So if we haven't met yet, my name is Hillary Levine, and I am the Coordinated Entry Program Coordinator with OCADSVA. And so I'm working on the project that intersects with the work that you all do at The Rock around coordinated entry and making sure that your processes work well for survivors of domestic and sexual violence, as well as other marginalized populations. So I've been doing that work since August, and I'm excited to be here today. And I'll let my coworker Renee introduce herself while I start screen sharing our slides.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Renee Kim. I'm the Equity and Access Coordinator for the Coalition, and I have been there about 2 years, and I'm excited to do this training with you all today. I may have to read some things closer to my face because I'm getting a new glasses prescription. So I just wanted to share
that. Right. So can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, so we just wanted to outline a little bit about what we'd be talking about today. As Jesse said, we are going to focus a little bit on what we call secondary trauma, or the trauma that can be incurred in doing a helping profession. But the first thing we wanted to touch on a little bit for y'all is just a little bit of a primer on the neurobiology of primary trauma, or the trauma that your clients may be experiencing, as well as the effects that may have on your direct services. And we've got a few tips and tricks on how to interact with and work with folks who may be coming in for your services who are dysregulated from trauma, to try to help them kind of get to where they need to be for you to be able to assist them in the moment. And then we're going to dive a little bit into vicarious trauma and how you and your staff may be affected by being present and supporting those who are experiencing trauma, and also listening to and validating all of their rough experiences that they've gone through. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some practices that folks can do themselves, as well as some organizational practices that can address vicarious trauma that comes through in direct service work. So our hope is this is just a very 101 surface level training in our member programs and in our type of work that we do. This is quite present because we know that we see a lot of burnout in our practitioners and in our advocates who work with survivors. And so we're hoping that we can kind of extend some of the knowledge that we've learned to y'all to help you, because as Jess said, we know that y'all have been working so hard, and with new coordinated entry processes or intake processes where you have to kind of ask folks some tough questions, you may be hearing a lot more about their lives experience, or with recession that may be coming, or all these funding cuts that we've seen, you're going to have folks showing up and be having to kind of do that really tough triage work and listening and validating folks. So we just wanted to kind of offer this training, and I wanted folks to know, I know we mostly have administrators or supervisors here today. As a part of our grant, we are available to come and do kind of more in-depth trainings to your staff if you think that that would be helpful. So just let me know. All right. Oh, and then we also wanted to let y'all know we will try to get through with time for questions at the end, but we're also super open to being interrupted. So unmute, speak up if you want to ask a question in the middle. We're happy to do it that way. All right, so Renee, if you want to take it away.
Yeah, thank you. So first, I would love to hear from folks very quickly, before I read this definition, how you define trauma in your work that you do around housing. Like maybe 3 folks could just chime in and say, this is how I define trauma, or how I see it come up in my workplace.
I know here at Orca we have case managers who, after listening to, stories after stories after stories after stories, have a less ability to be able to process it all and still go on with a normal life. So to them, that's trauma. It's not their trauma, but having to listen to it all the time makes it their trauma, because you can't go home and forget about it.
Yes. Thank you. Anyone else? That's one. So 3 people, 2 more. Oh, okay, I'll go ahead and read this. Trauma results from an event or a series of events or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful for or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning physically, socially, emotionally, and their spiritual well-being. And this can show up in a lot of different ways for your clients. In some ways, it can show up um, that it might not even seem logical to you, but their behavior is showing you that they are either really kind of disconnected, or they may not show up physically for appointments. They may not want to sign your paperwork. They may throw kind of a, in quotes, a temper tantrum, and you have no idea why this is happening. So just thinking about that definition about trauma and the results is really important. Okay, the next thing is the characteristics and causes of trauma. And one thing I wanted to share that I forgot to say in the very beginning is one of the jobs, I've had a lot of jobs, but anyway, one of the jobs that I had before I got to the coalition was working as a counselor and teacher at Coffee Creek Correctional Facility. So that place had a ton of trauma, and it is a really, for lack of better words, it was a very inspiring and interesting and scary place to work in a lot of different levels. So I just want to let you know that, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to be through that lens of the work that I did there. So this next slide, characteristics and causes of trauma. It can be physical or mental abuse. It can be a natural disaster. The loss piece can come through imprisonment or a sudden death, loss of housing, loss of your job, and just that general feeling like you have no control over your life. So regardless of the source, it is an emotional trauma. And there are 3 common elements of this. One is that it was really sudden and it was startling to you. Like you could feel it in your body, you knew it in your head, but you just really couldn't believe it, right? The second one is that the person was completely unprepared. And third is that there was nothing that the person could do to prevent it from happening. So trauma is definitely informed by how quickly the upset is triggered, by how frequently it happens, how intensely, how long it lasts, and actually how long does it actually take to calm down. So I really love this slide, and the piece that I would take from this slide definitely is the key thing to remember is the section on the, let's see, left, right, is how quickly it happened, how frequently it's happening, how intense it is, and how long it lasts, and how long it takes to calm down. All right, the story of our brain. Oh, I don't have a storybook like with pictures and I can show you about our brain. But I have seen pictures like, in movies where it's like a little piece of meat or something. But anyway, I just wanted to share that this biopsychosocial model is definitely something that we subscribe to at Coffee Creek. And I'm going to read a little bit about the biopsychosocial model for you. So physiologically, any type of change or new demand that may cause stress on the person in their brain, these psychological issues can contribute to the development and course of a psychotic disorder that you may or may not know that your client has. The biological piece is the meaning that when you were born with or with gene expression that is most likely the pieces that give you and make up your given biology. It's somatic and it can be biologically caused through different types of vulnerabilities. And each of us have this as an individual. And the social piece is that any psychological problem depends on the social interaction and response to the environment. So it makes a really big difference of who um, or where you live and how you live. So our environment really affects these functions of our brain, because our brains are always moving and working and they're in action, even when they're resting a little bit. So the story of our brain, first thinking of that model, always wanting to seek wholeness and integration, meaning that we want to have our body and our brain somehow integrate into one, and that there are two regions that are informed and engaged in our experience with trauma and violence. Relationships matter. Remembering that piece about it really makes a big difference of where and how you live. Also, supports are vast, they're varied, and they're ancient. And this is an emerging field, so you want to stay open and very curious. And when we talk about the supports are vast, varied, and ancient, that can be a lot of people, I don't know if you all believe this or not, but a lot of things that make us up are things that come from our ancestors. And so we have innate DNA that we may not even be aware of. And so I just wanted to share that. Sometimes people get a little confused and like, what does that mean? So I just wanted to share that. Alrighty, so our brains are structured into three main parts. And I want you to know that I'm gonna read this to you. I am not a science person. I failed science many times along with math. So I just wanted to share that, get that out of the way. But I want you to know about these three parts of our brain that are pretty important. And the first part is the cortex, which is the outer surface where our higher thinking skills arise. It includes the frontal cortex, the most recently evolved portion of the brain. And this is the part where at Coffee Creek, we called it the logic brain. So that's the place where you can plan and organize and do math and all of those kinds of things. The second part is the limbic system, and that's the center of the brain where all of our emotions evolve. At Coffee Creek, we call that the emotion mind, right? So a lot of people, especially clients that I worked with there, really were either in one place or the other. And the goal was to always get people to what we called wise mind. So taking a balance of your logic and your emotion mind and getting into wise mind. The brainstem is the reptilian part of the brain that controls our basic survival functions. And next, we're going to thank Dan Siegel. He is one of the gurus of neurobiology. And this is called the hand model of the brain. A lot of people call it flipping your lid. And so what I'd like for you to do, if you feel comfortable, you don't have to, but I'd love for you to just put your whole hand up, all 5 fingers. We're not going to flip each other off. We're just going to put our hand up. Then we're going to slowly fold our thumb in. And then just finger by finger, just cover up your thumb and just kind of notice how that feels for you and how your thumb feels. You know, it may feel a little more protected or a little comfortable, but say you've got this car driving by you and they sideswipe you, and what happens? You totally flip your lid, right? All of the emotion pieces are just like right out there. And this is a great model to use when thinking about your clients, because our clients, a lot of times, especially in housing and when it comes to all the paperwork and all this stuff, they're usually in this mode. They are rarely like this and calm. So I use this model often with women when they were going to chow line, when they had count time, And it was a very calming reminder and experience for them. And believe it or not, this little model, it also helps what I talked about a little earlier. It helps that brain-body connection, right? Because you can actually feel yourself kind of calming down. So I wanted to show you that.
I wanted to add to Renee, if it's okay,
Yeah.
that one of the things that Dan Siegel has done also with this model is they're incorporating it into using it in schools. And it's a way that children, when they're feeling dysregulated or they're feeling like they're in their brainstem and they're just, you know, emotionally reacting to things, they can actually use this to signal to their teacher that that's where they're at, so that the teacher can then respond appropriately, which is really cool,
Oh, I
in my
love
opinion.
that. I didn't know that. That's great. All right, so I just finished talking about that, kind of flipping your lid. And here are just, I'm not going to read all of these things, but I'm going to read you kind of the top 3 or 4 that I think definitely happens when your lid is flipped. One is for sure the all or nothing thinking. It's like, you know, it's one way or the other. There is no in between. Catastrophizing is a really big thing. This is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. You are the worst person I've ever worked with. I don't ever want to see you again. I mean, it's just like really global and really big. Focusing on the negative is also a huge thing. And the other piece, which I really like in here, is that magical thinking. And magical thinking can lead people to just think like, well, you know, if this, you know, if A happens, then I guess B will automatically happen. You know, I kind of filled out most of my paperwork and they can just finish it. They can figure it out. They know that I already need this assistance, so it's not going to be a big deal. So magical thinking happens a lot. So for you all to be able to fill in those blanks is really important. And these are questions that I would pose to you to think for yourself. Of course, we'd love for our clients to think this way, but it also depends on how emotionally regulated they are. But if you're able to think like, are these thoughts helpful? I.e., am I thinking this person is so disorganized, or I've seen this person 12 times in 1 week, you know, so are these thoughts helpful? No, they're probably not. Each day is a new day. Each appointment is a new appointment. Do these thoughts contain thinking strategies? Have I thought about like, oh, I'm going to see Hillary. I saw her 12 times last week. I'd really only like to see her 4 times maximum this week. So how can I, you know, be strategic? Let's finish like this one section of this form. Okay, we're only going to do section A, something like that. Are there alternate explanations for their possible behavior? Would I say this to a friend? Would I have the same tone? Would I have the same kind of nonverbal stuff going on if I was speaking with a friend or a neighbor? And then really, how did I learn to think this way, right? It's like, how did I start thinking or prejudging or whatever it is that I'm doing? How did I start thinking that? And when did that start to formulate? Because a lot of how we behave really can transfer and translate over to how we treat others. And it seems really simple, but boy, when you're in the moment and you're with a client that's really having, they're just really in their trauma, it can be difficult to pull yourself back and kind of reset yourself. So I think that's really an important skill, and it's just learned over time. So anyway, okay, that's the flipping the cognitive lid piece.
Renee, can I share one example? Is that okay?
No. Yes. I'm kidding.
So in the direct service work that I did for years with survivors, the thing that I found the most helpful as an advocate was the are there alternative explanations? And I think that that ties really well into one of the main tenets of trauma-informed care, which is rather than thinking what's wrong with you, you think what has happened to you. So if you're being presented with a behavior that doesn't quite make sense to you, if you can take the time to ask, gosh, this is seeming very difficult for you. What's happening for you right now? You know, what has happened in the past that might be triggering what this is, and kind of working through that. I don't know, in my opinion, I found this very helpful. For instance, particularly when having to fill out very meticulous paperwork like a restraining order, you would find that people just were very resistant to giving certain pieces of information or certain processes. And if you could kind of be transparent and explain the process, but also ask them, you know, what's happened that you don't want to share this, it was a lot easier to come to a common understanding.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. That's great. Yeah, super relevant. So the next slide is primary trauma responses. And as you kind of peruse this list, you'll see cognitive responses, physical, and we all do these things. Some of us may just really become very numb when it comes to trauma things happening. Or some of us may move into that all or nothing thinking, or some may just really focus on the negative. It has a lot of the same pieces that we just saw on the last slide. The other piece is that it's always affecting our brain and our body. And, you know, just when you think that you have this kind of like your own personal response down pat, you have to think about the client that you're working with and think about all the different layers of trauma. And like we talked about earlier, the original event, the intensity, how long has it been going on? It just makes their responses oftentimes more intense as well. So everybody has their own kind of quirky ways of having these primary trauma responses. Many are these on the screen, but many are things that you would never even think of. Like for me, I'd love to organize things and tidy up things and throw things out, but sometimes I can get overboard, right? So it's that pulling yourself back and knowing that, okay, this is what's actually happening in my mind and in my body. So let's take a break from there. So that is a list of some of the primary trauma responses. And they're important because everybody does, like I said, different things.
All right, so when we were thinking about discussing trauma with you as housing and safety net providers, one thing that I wanted to share with you is something that I have found fascinating and have kind of been following as I work in social services, and that is there are new studies that are showing that the effects of ongoing poverty actually has effects on our neurobiology that might be similar to PTSD. So we talked a little bit about trauma earlier, and we talked about it being a sudden thing, quick, you know, and folks feeling helpless, like they didn't have any choice in the matter. So that's kind of our original thinking on trauma, and, you know, each incident kind of affects you. But now we're really starting to look at the ongoing effects of living in a situation where you may feel that way daily or multiple times a day, and you're just trying to survive. And so I included a interesting article here, and we'll be sharing the slides with you. So if you want to peruse that, you may. But one thing that I found hopeful was that while it did outline that living long-term in poverty can have the same effects as sustained trauma, and it does cause long-term health effects, including atrophy in the hippocampus, what they did find in some studies was that positive interventions actually was able to undo these effects or help people to move past these effects. So for instance, in this Psychology Today article, one of the studies was done on children who were in orphanages, and they found that they would experience these kind of beginnings of long-term effects and effects on their brain. However, if there was a positive intervention that got them into foster care or an adoption where they had positive interactions throughout the day, they started to see those effects of atrophy going away, or they had a chance to kind of overcome that. So I wanted to kind of bring that to your attention for two reasons. First, just because I don't think it's often that we hear poverty talked about as an ongoing trauma, even though I'm sure when you speak with your clients, you can recognize that, right? That the everyday existence within poverty, including extreme poverty and homelessness, is going to have its effects. But then there's also some hopefulness in there that, you know, us as helper professions coming and helping to provide positive interactions in the way that we help folks, as well as positive outcomes, can have effects on that in the long term.
All right, so the next slide is core strategies for assisting clients with a trauma reaction. One of the things, before I get into the slide, I was going to talk about at Coffee Creek, I taught these mindfulness classes, and it was a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness practices. And so I would open and close each class with a mindfulness exercise. And so I'm actually going to teach you just a snippet of that because it may be helpful and useful for you all when you're working with your clients as well. But looking at this slide, the in the moment piece is really important, and that's that self-soothing kind of that, you know, the fingers protecting the thumb and all of that. That's the skill of being able to validate the client, give back agency, being transparent with them, and building trust, building relationships with them, and using not only their coping skills, but your own breathing and coping skills. And then the long term is really trying to figure out what is it that really actually does bring me some joy or some relaxation, rejuvenation, you know, maybe some pleasant activities, making sure that you're eating well, and exercising. I don't like exercising, so exercise really, it can be just movement, just walking, you know, picking some flowers, playing with your pets, whatever it is. And you don't want to do too much social networking because your eyes will get tired and they'll get all red if you're on your screen all the time. So, you know, that's up to you. And also sleeping well. And sleeping well is very challenging for a lot of people, but being able to have some of those other self-soothing skills are really helpful. So one of the grounding exercises that I would always start and end each class with was a technique. It was a mindfulness technique. It was called square breathing, and you can just look that up on the web if you want for square breathing. But the other piece that I think is really important is that when clients come to us and they're in a crisis and they're experiencing the effects of immediate trauma, we can use our skills, like I said earlier, to help them kind of self-soothe in the moment. So I'm going to do a quick exercise with you all, and I know that this is virtual, so it's going to feel a little weird, but it won't be too weird because we won't do it very long. So what I'm going to ask you to do is make sure that your feet are flat on the ground and that you're sitting in a position that's comfortable for you. And you can either close your eyes or you can just lower your gaze. And I'm going to ask you to just drop your shoulders and unlock your jaw. And take a nice deep breath in and exhale out at your own pace. And one more breath in and out at your own pace. And take one more deep breath in and exhale out. Wiggle your toes if you can. Make sure you're still connected to the ground. And when you are ready, you can open your eyes and slowly put your head forward and up and just relax. And so that is something that we would spend time opening, like I said, the classes and also closing them. And it's also a great technique to teach clients as well. And it doesn't have to be the actual square breathing technique. It can just be what we just did. You can only do it one time or two times, you know, just very quickly. So I just wanted to give you that something for your tool toolbox. So thank you.
One thing before we jump into vicarious trauma as opposed to primary trauma that I wanted to kind of note is my experience in housing is primarily in working in an emergency shelter for survivors. And what we found is that when we were doing the intake process or when we were building relationship with folks, these in the moment kind of self-soothing and techniques really helped to kind of prime for that longer term case management that we would do. So while in the shelter setting, we'd be doing all the similar case management techniques that your case managers probably do. You know, what's our next step in housing? Do you have EBT? Do you have connection to all the resources that you need? But also a part of that process would be validating and teaching folks long-term self-care tips, as well as when I say validating, like giving people permission to practice self-care, right? Like often, particularly folks who are coming from abusive situations, they were shamed or not allowed to take any times for themselves. And so a lot of our case management techniques really incorporated talking about these long-term ways that folks could learn to regulate over time and to heal from trauma that they had experienced. And that was a really kind of a powerful tool that I think probably has some implications in your work if you're doing long-term case management with folks. So just wanted to kind of note that. Okay, so now we're going to move into vicarious trauma, also often called secondary traumatic stress. And this is what we were talking about a little bit in the beginning and what I think Laura touched on with her example. So this is the stress that you may feel as a service worker or someone working in a helping profession that happens because you are constantly showing up for your clients and kind of hearing about very traumatic experiences and holding space for those. So one thing that I really want to focus on is that vicarious traumatization is actually a transformation in the self of the trauma worker or helper. So it results from empathetic engagement with traumatized clients and their reports of traumatic experiences. So one thought that I was thinking of just in terms of looping it into the coordinated entry work that I've been doing with your programs is when I've talked to folks, when I was doing my listening sessions with housing agencies, a lot of what we've heard is, you know, this new coordinated entry process has opened it up to, you know, instead of kind of a cut and dry intake process, we're now having to dig deep with people and ask them about traumatic experiences in their life, right? Because a lot of those questions are about like drug usage or domestic and sexual violence. And so you all might be stepping into a new territory where you're hearing a lot more of this. So this is why we kind of wanted to come together and share a little bit of the expertise from our movement and the things that we've been doing to try to help our service workers, you know, not only show up to work, but thrive in their work. So I wanted to outline, there are some other terms that you may hear that are similar to vicarious traumatization, but that are a little bit different. So one is compassion fatigue, and that's a condition that's characterized by emotional and physical exhaustion. And what it does is it leads to a diminished ability to empathize or feel compassion for others, right? So we, as practitioners, are professionals, right? And we are hearing and validating these folks' experiences, but we also have to respond professionally and process in the moment, right? So over and over having to do that and having to kind of hold space for that trauma and continue on or be the person who is, you know, helping the person to come back from being dysregulated can actually cause us to have less empathy and compassion for similar stories because we're kind of swimming in it and having to respond in certain ways. But that is a little bit more of kind of like a fatigue or a burnout, which is the other thing that I wanted to talk about. So burnout is that state of emotional, physical, or mental exhaustion that you can get from excessive or prolonged stress. So it can happen when you feel overwhelmed, emotionally drained, or unable to meet constant demands, right? So burnout is one of those things in our jobs that can come from listening to folks' experiences and holding trauma and being that kind of, you know, navigator of that. But it also can come from systems, right? Like it can just be the fact that you have so many people you have to see in a day. Or gosh, you have to do all this data entry when what you really want to do is sit with your client and make sure that they are feeling okay before they leave their appointment. So the big thing that I wanted to kind of juxtapose is that compassion fatigue and burnout can both be symptoms of vicarious trauma, but they're a little bit more connected to kind of exhaustion and fleeting feelings of, oh, I'm just tired, maybe a vacation will handle it, or if I just get away for a while. Whereas vicarious trauma or secondary trauma is something that happens over time and actually shifts your entire worldview and shifts the way that you even look at your helping profession or your clients. And so we're going to delve a little bit more into that as we kind of go forward. All right. So I think I touched on this just a little bit, but the vicarious trauma, it's a transformation in the helper's inner sense of identity and existence that results from utilizing that controlled empathy while listening to trauma content narratives. And that's what I was talking about when we as professionals have to hear this, and it can't be about us, right? Like we can't start crying or we can't empathize maybe in the ways that we would with family members or people that we hold dear, because we are in this helper professionalization role. So we kind of have to compartmentalize, hear the trauma, validate, and help folks to move forward. So vicarious trauma is what happens to your neurological or cognitive, physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual health when you listen to traumatic stories day after day while having to control your reaction. And I'm sorry, I've got some naughty dogs. I'm just going to take a second to close the door real quick.
Right before this training, I got my dog in from trying to catch a mole. I have this mole tearing up my yard. She's caught 3 already. What to share?
My dogs really love to protect us from any car that goes down the road, so. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the responses that you might see coming up in yourself or coming up in your staff if they're starting to kind of veer into reactions and vicarious trauma. So we might have difficulty managing our own emotions or even tolerating emotional expressions by others. We might be irritable or have changes in our mood. We'll have social withdrawal or disruption of personal relationships. We'll start to fail to nurture non-work aspects of our life. So work may actually kind of become our life, or it's, you know, causing such a shift in the way we think that now things that we used to enjoy externally in our life, we don't. Or we'll talk a little bit more about this, but it kind of can sometimes cause an us versus them mentality. Other folks don't understand what I go through at work. They wouldn't understand if I even started to tell them some of the stories I heard, or I'm not allowed to, right? Privacy protections. So we start to kind of withdraw from those social supports that we have. We can see sleep problems. We can see loss of faith or a sense of meaning and purpose. And we can see feelings of hopelessness or loss of purpose. And I think that this is very directly tied to the fact that a lot of us who come into these helper professions are either drawn to it because we have a background that's similar to the folks that we're helping, or we have a worldview that we think that, you know, housing is a human right, or folks deserve to be free of violence, right? Like those are very strong morals that we carry into the work with us. And if the work is starting to burn us out, it can affect that worldview. And we start to feel kind of jaded about those things that once we held very dear. So I wanted to share this graphic with you. So this is a graphic that comes from a book called Trauma Stewardship. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the book when we get to resources. But this is a wonderful book for anybody who is working in a helping profession or wants to supervise folks and help folks with trauma stewardship or sitting with trauma without experiencing vicarious or secondary trauma. So these are some very similar trauma exposure responses that come up in secondary trauma, and some of them are similar to what we see in primary trauma, but some of them are a little bit more indicative of that shift in worldview. And the ones that I wanted to kind of focus on with you are grandiosity and an inflated sense of importance related to one's work, a sense that one can never do enough, and inability to empathize and numbing. And I think that inability to empathize and numbing is very similar to compassion fatigue that we talked about. And the reason that I wanted to highlight those three for you is that, so trauma stewardship has a lot of really great questions one can ask oneself, and writing prompts and different things that you can work through to really work on trauma stewardship as opposed to being affected by secondary trauma. And the three that I noted to you is, I just wanted to be super vulnerable and say that when I was doing direct service work, those were my triggers. So those were the three that I knew that if I was experiencing those, that I was in secondary trauma mode. So a sense that you can never do enough, right? Like you can have a super productive day and check off all the boxes, but I still didn't find housing for all my clients, or people are still unhoused, or domestic and sexual violence still happens. We'll get another call tomorrow, right? That kind of hopelessness and that we can never do enough. And then that grandiosity, that idea that only I can do the work, right? Like I am the only one that can be effective at this work. None of my coworkers could step in and do this. I am the only one that possesses these skills. So those are some kind of common responses that I see in myself when I'm experiencing secondary trauma. And then when I was supervising folks who were advocates for survivors, I saw these a lot. And these are not necessarily behaviors that we often associate with trauma or negative, that we associate negatively, right? Like sometimes in our service agencies, and we'll talk a little bit about organizational culture around trauma, but sometimes these are seen as a plus, right? Like she never has anyone take over her clients, always makes sure that she's the one that does it. She's the only one that can do it. She's always trying to do more and more and more each day. So I just kind of wanted to show those and shift and show you how, you know, while we might see those as a benefit sometimes, they also can be someone who is really deeply feeling this secondary trauma. All right. So we've talked a lot about secondary trauma. So then what are we trying to do in our organizations and within ourselves when we counterbalance secondary trauma or vicarious trauma? Well, one concept is that we want to get to a place where we can build vicarious resilience. And so what this is this happens when we are in the right place as professionals, that we can experience personal growth in our own life through witnessing the growth of our clients, right? So we're there, we are doing enough work on ourselves that we are taking in trauma and processing it and not holding it and allowing it to affect us. And then we're also able to see it through to celebrate triumphs or to see the way that our clients are resilient and how we have helped them to go, you know, to move on to what we're trying to see. So this is called vicarious resilience. And another concept is we are always trying to build compassion, satisfaction in our work. So that's the enjoyment and gratification that a professional trauma helper feels when they are able to perform their work well. Right? So feelings of efficacy that extend into life beyond the job and become a part of who you are as a whole person, right? So when we have compassion, satisfaction, it's the same as vicarious trauma, whereas it extends out beyond our work life. But in this case, it's not those negative effects. It's the idea that my work life is one part of who I am and I'm effective and it's great and it's connected to me as a whole person. We'll talk a little bit more about compassion satisfaction when we get to resources as well, because there's some different kind of scaling that you can do and self-assessment to see if you have that in your work life and in your life that I've included. Okay, so now we're going to talk about self-care, the buzzword that we've all been hearing for a while, right? So self-care. So self-care is oftentimes what we look at and what the individual can do. So your individual workers are you. what you can do to center yourself in the work to not experience vicarious trauma. So they are intentional and deliberate methods of attending to the needs of our bodies, minds, and spirit, and they're vital to the prevention of vicarious trauma and the process of responding and healing from it, right? So one of my absolute favorite quotes is from our supervisor, Vanessa Timmons. She's the executive director of the Oregon Coalition. And this was years ago. I was a brand new advocate starting out in a shelter program. And she said, you know, when we talk about self-care, we always, you know, talk about the surface level things. But I just want you to know that if you're not tending to all of the things like your body, mind, and spirit, there's not enough chocolate, wine, or bubble baths that are going to get you through this work, right? So I feel like sometimes when we're taking self-care from the surface level, we think about those things, which are awesome, like those, you know, treat yourself, kind of be nice to yourself things after a long day. And those are really good, and those can be a part of a self-care plan. But if we're not really digging deep and figuring out like spiritually what we need to keep doing the work, you know, what we need to do to process trauma in our minds, then those are not going to hold us long-term in the work. Okay. So I included this in here. I thought that this was great. And in fact, I actually used to have this, I printed these out, and a lot of the folks that I supervise just kind of had these taped up on their computers or in their workplace as kind of a quick reference point for self-care. And it's called the Trauma Stewardship Institute's Tiny Survival Guide. And it is a part of that institute that came out with the book, Trauma Stewardship. So I'm just gonna go through a couple of them because some of them are those kind of fun, treat yourself, you know, nice self-care things. And then a little bit more of them are those deeper processes that we have to work on. So one is protect your mornings, right? So they're saying less cortisol, more intentionality. And one thing that they talk about if you go to any of their trainings is that just with the modern way that we live life, from the second that we get up, everything can be a cortisol response, right? Like everything can be quick, 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 go, go, go. And so if you're at all able to kind of protect your morning and intentionally let yourself kind of slide into your process in your workday, it actually can set your cortisol levels for the rest of the day to not be so up, so that you're not flipping your lid throughout your day when you're working with your clients or with your kids or with your coworkers. They talk a lot about being active and detoxing and finding ways to metabolize all of your experiences. So ways to regulate your nervous system. So some people metabolize what they've experienced through physical activity. You know, some people will have a really rough day or hear a really traumatic event, and then if they go for a run, that has metabolized it through. And there's lots of that neurobiology science stuff that says that there are studies that show that that is one way that we are able to just kind of process through things that we keep in our emotions. We can also just do things like laugh, be in community, admire art, make sure we have sleep, right? So some of the more deep level things though that we kind of have to worry about are things like simplifying in our life. You know, making sure that we don't have cognitive overload, making sure that we can attend to our bare necessities, which doesn't always happen in organizations when we have larger caseloads, more people we want to help, right? So if we can kind of incorporate those into our daily, the way that we daily practice and the way that our organization supports people that we'll talk about a little bit more, it can be super helpful. And then some things that are really important when you're working in this field is to clarify your intentions and have good boundaries. So we may not necessarily think of those as self-care, but they really are, right? So if I come into the work with a really strong idea of how I rephrase from causing harm, and maybe there's a new policy that came up that now is like at odds with that belief that I came into, I have to really work with myself to clarify my boundaries and my intentions around how am I going to feel good about the work that I'm doing while still working within this context, right? Because we all know that there are always going to be some policies or procedures or things you have to do in your job that just might be at odds with the way that you want to do things. And so if we're able to have a practice that clarifies our intentions and reminds ourselves of how we're pushing those forward, it can be really great for this type of work. And then, like we talked about, healthy boundaries, both with clients and with your workload and with your coworkers, as well as a healthy way to leave work at work, are very important to self-care. Oh, and then of course, spending time with animals. We all just talked about animals. Mine, sometimes I like to say, are a little bit more stressful, and actually spending time away from them is good in nature. But you know, all of those kind of wonderful things that we can do to just be outside of ourselves. So y'all are gonna get these slides, like I say, and if you wanna print this out, it's here for you. You can put it up at your desk and kind of, you know, if you're having a rough day, look at one or two of these and try to figure out, how can I incorporate this into my day? All right, so we've talked a little bit about self-care, right? And that's kind of on the individual. You know, that would be kind of us saying, all right, the organization is what the organization is, and each case manager, each manager is responsible for showing up and making sure they're ready to do the work and have it not impact them. Which there is some of that, right? Like, but it's got to be both and. So we need to sometimes shift within our organization the emphasis from the individual worker doing self-care to organizational community support and processing of vicarious trauma, right? So we want to do a move from thinking about well-being as an individual activity to a responsibility of a collective one. It requires that those who have the power to shape organizational culture make space for it, even during times of crisis, right? Which I know is hard, because I know that right now, much the same as our member programs are feeling a time of crisis with COVID and all the effects, you all are too. But if we are able to kind of create organizational culture and space for talking about vicarious trauma and supporting one another through it, it creates the potential for thriving rather than just surviving through your job. So I wanted to outline just a few risk factors that they outline for vicarious trauma on the organizational level. So if you work in an organization that has a lack of awareness of vicarious trauma and the way it manifests, or a work culture that prizes toughing it out, dealing with tasks and emotions on your own, and moving on without making space to process, or a culture that has policies that don't allow enough time off or other opportunities to recharge, you are more likely to experience vicarious trauma. So these are some of the ways we're going to talk a little bit in the next slide about some of the ways that organizationally you can look at supporting folks through vicarious trauma. Okay, so first I want to read a quote, because I thought that this was so poignant in doing my research and kind of thinking about the ways that organizations can support. And this is from R.N. Riemann, MD, who is a doctor who has studied a lot on vicarious trauma. And the quote is, "The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet." Right? So that's kind of one of the first things when I think about organizational ways to support workers, is just accepting that vicarious trauma is a part of the job. It's not that you didn't tough it out enough or you didn't self-care enough. It's kind of acknowledging that if we do this work long enough, all of us will struggle with this. And if we can help each other to process that, maybe have levels of accountability where we can call one another on it and say, hey, Hillary, you're getting into that grandiose thinking space. Like, I can help you with your client too. How are you feeling? Those types of things. That creates a climate where we are engaging and leaning into processing vicarious trauma. So education is really important. If you can discuss and provide resources on secondary trauma and see self-care as integral and more than wine and a bath, right? That's my kind of touch point I like to bring back to. But if we can really work with those that we work with to do the deep digging and to figure out what they need to be present and to show up for the work, and if that's normalized, that's like a huge step that an organization can do to support. So you kind of undo that tough it out culture, and you see vicarious trauma as a common response, if not actively avoided. So no judgments. If someone is, it's kind of similar to that trauma-informed care principle of not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you, right? So even with our coworkers and our supervisees, we can say, rather than be like, hey, you're really negative lately, what's wrong with you? We can say, hey, what's happening? I think that you're having a little bit of vicarious trauma. You know, what's going on for you in your life? And I wanted to, I think that I skipped one little note that I just wanted to make sure, yeah. So one, I wanted to go back because we talked about some of the organizational risk factors for vicarious trauma. And I want to give you just a few of the individual risk factors for vicarious trauma, because as a supervisor or within an organization, then you can help folks who are at higher risk for experiencing vicarious trauma. So if you are someone who has a personal experience of trauma in your life, you have lack of social support, you have stressors in other areas of your life, or you have poor boundaries, you are more likely to quickly be affected by secondary trauma. So those are some kind of clues that you can use around how you talk with folks around what they're experiencing. And I think that most of the folks here have been in this work for a long time, so we can all point to times in our life where, gosh, work got really hard because my social supports outside of work were not working for me, or other areas of my life were hard, or trauma that I experienced came up for me again. And, you know, maybe this client had my exact same story and I didn't have a great way to process it and it became apparent. So if you can create a climate of support with supervision and check-ins around well-being, or incorporate personal self-care plans into supervision, as well as making sure that your organization provides ample PTO and permission to take self-care days, that is a great way to kind of help folks in longevity and staying in the work. And then another big thing is to debrief and breathe. You know, allow time in the staff's day to debrief with peers and just talk through things, to metabolize what they've heard. Or even to take a moment between clients to do some square breathing themselves, or some of those techniques that Renee talked about. When I was supervising advocates, we also tried to incorporate a lot of that mindfulness into our meeting times. So we would do a check-in and then a quick square breathing round all together to kind of be able to focus as we came into meetings. And that was super helpful. And then another thing that I think is really important for creating a climate of support and organization that supports folks is also to have a space where you can celebrate the positive outcomes, right? Like celebrate the good that you're doing, because sometimes when clients are just coming in day after day and you're hearing awful stories, it starts to feel like you haven't made a difference. And if we can, you know, find time to come together and celebrate when good things happen, it really can help folks keep going. One story that I heard that I think is really relevant to the time right now is there was an ER in New York, and one nurse who floated between the ER and the urgent care wing, or the intensive care unit, was realizing that the ER workers were working really hard to stabilize COVID clients as they came in. And then those clients were just taken to the ICU and they never knew what the outcome was. So they started having a huddle every now and again where they read the names of those folks who had been discharged and were healthy. And they took a moment to cheer and to celebrate the positive outcomes. And they said that that had a huge effect in their ability to show up and still do the work every day, right? Because how do we keep going if we don't know that sometimes there are positive outcomes? So if we can kind of incorporate that into our culture and the way that we support folks, that's just so important. Okay, so we've outlined a few resources for you, and it looks like we're coming right up on 12:30. So I just wanted to note, I did, Renee included a great book that she has read and loves. It's called Calming the Emotional Storm, Using Dialectical Behavioral Therapy Skills to Manage Your Emotions and Balance Your Life. And that has a lot of those little breathing exercises or different prompts or reading things that you can do, both as a practitioner to make sure that you're able to center yourself when your lid is flipped, as well as to help clients to learn those skills for doing that. I included Trauma Stewardship, an everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others. I can't recommend this book enough. When I was a supervisor at a domestic and sexual violence agency, we included in our budget enough money to buy a copy of this book for every new staff member that came on. And then we also read it as a group. and incorporated practices into our supervision as well as our meetings, and it was wonderful. There's another book called Transforming the Pain, a workbook on vicarious traumatization, which has some great readings and things. Oh yeah, there's Renee showing you the book. That has some more practices that you can do. And then I really wanted to draw attention to this, the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit. This is a toolkit that is put out for organizations to actually, there's checklists and different ways that you can make sure that your organization is creating a culture that supports vicarious trauma. The Healing Justice podcast is always just a great podcast that I've been listening to for years for folks who are in healing professions or helping professions. And then I included here the ProQual, which is a quality of life scales, which is a self-assessment for compassion fatigue, satisfaction, and burnout. And so it's interesting. We used this a little bit too at the agency that I worked at as part of supervision, or even just did it every 3 or 4 months. And, you know, people didn't have to discuss it, but you basically just rate on a scale of 1 to 5 some different factors. And then based on your score, it tells you if you're probably experiencing compassion fatigue or burnout, or if you're experiencing compassion satisfaction in your work. And they're kind of nice, because sometimes it's hard for us to do that assessing for ourselves. So we would use that sometimes prophylactically to help ourselves know if we needed to step up our self-care game, or me as a supervisor, if someone said, hey, I didn't do very well on this last assessment, then I got to kind of step up my game in supporting the person in getting through the vicarious trauma. So that is us done talking at you. Do you have any questions or, you know, anything you'd like to kind of state based on stuff we talked about, or any of your experiences?
Thanks, Hillary. That was great.
It was, and I really liked the last piece that you talked about, where you could assess people, especially our case managers, so that you can support them better. I'd really like to implement that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, you know, moving towards that organizational culture is, it's not perfect. And I moved out of that supervisory role to come into this coalition role as we were starting some of these, but we were seeing some pretty great effects on the way that folks felt about the job. And, you know, I'm pretty passionate about organizational culture and the way that we as agencies can support our workers in longevity in the work, and supervisors. So if you ever want to chat about that more, or like I said, if you want us to do a training for your staff around these types of things, we'd be happy to do that as a part of our project. And we will be including this training on the web portal that will be made that you will have access to for onboarding and things. So it'll be kind of a training that you can have access to ongoingly. But if you want us to come in and do more tailored training for your staff or things like that, I'd be happy to.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you